Shalom, we're continuing with Perek Ches. A few things have happened. David HaMelech was able to bring the Aron HaKodesh from Kiryas Ye'arim to Ir David. David HaMelech wanted to build the Beis HaMikdash, but Nathan HaNavi told him that you cannot because you're a man of blood. Only your son Shlomo will be able to do so. And David gave a tremendous prayer of Hakaras HaTayv to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for all of his chesed. And Perek Ches begins with the military exploits against the Plishtim and other nations, in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu is keeping the promise that he made to David that he would be victorious over all of his enemies. Vayach Rechain, Vayach David es Plishtim, David was able to smite the Philistines. Vayach Niem, he subjected them, at least temporarily. Vayikach David es Mesek Ha'ama Miyad Plishtim, he was able to conquer a town that was called Mesek Ha'ama and take it away from the Plishtim. So that's one Nitzachim. Pasuk Beis, Vayach es Mayav, and then he waged war against Mayav. Mayav is living on the east bank of the Yarden. Vayemadedem b'chevel hashkev osam arza vayemaded shnei chavalim lahamis umalo hachevel lahachayos vatihi Moav leDavid liavadim naisei mincha. So here, David exacted a very unusual penalty against the Moabites. He took ropes, and ropes had a certain standard length in terms of how many amos was a rope. He made the Moabites lie on the ropes. They were, so to speak, perpendicular to the ropes. And 2 rope lengths were killed, and a rope length was allowed to survive. So, for example, make up a number, I don't have the numbers. If the length of a standard rope was 10 amos, so 2 rope lengths were 20 amos, so people were lying down along the 20 amos, they would be killed, the next 10 amos would live, and the remainder of the Moabites who lived became slaves who would give tribute to David. Now here I do have to add a little bit of a horror. Moab is, of course, descended from Lot, and the Torah actually prohibits the Jewish people from waging war against Moab or taking Moabite territory, because, so to speak, because they're the descendants of Lot, they have that territory until Yemot HaMashiach. So we're actually not allowed to wage war against Ammon or Moab. But this was different, because indeed we are told that when David was running away from Shaul and was trying to protect his family, he brought his family to Moab, thinking that the Moabites would protect his family, because after all, David himself comes from Moab, because his great-grandmother is Rus, the Moaviyah. So David thought the Moabites would be friendly. In point of fact, Moabites murdered Yishai and all of David's brothers and their wives and their children, and there was a massacre. So as a result, the Moabites were the aggressors. They were the Reitvim. They were the murderers of Jews. And that would have given David a heter to wage milchama against Moav, and that is what he did. So first war was against the Plishtim, second was against Moab. Vayach David, now again, it doesn't say that he conquered all the Moabites, but whatever group of Moabites he was fighting, this is what he did. Vayach David es Hadad Ezer ben Rechov melech Tzaiva, and then David smote Hadad Ezer, the son of Rechov, the king of Tzaiva. Now Tzaiva, Aram Tzaiva, is Syria. David went into Syria. Now this is going to be halachically very significant, because Aram Tzaiva is a territory that is beyond the Torah's boundaries of Eretz Yisrael. And because of this, it is called a kibush yachid, a private conquest. Now there's a machlekes Rashi in Tosfos, what makes it a kibush yachid? Rashi says it's a kibush yachid because David conquered it to be his private enclave and not to be national territory. Tosfos says it's a kibush yachid because David conquered it before he had conquered the rest of Eretz Yisrael. There were still shtachim in Eretz Yisrael that had not been conquered. So because of this, it doesn't have the kedusha of a kibush rabim. So there's a huge machlokes throughout Shas whether kibush yachid shemei kibush, and therefore Aram Tzaiva is chayav in Trumas and Maisris, or kibush yachid loy shemei kibush, and Aram Tzaiva is not chayav in Trumos and Maisris. Now, it may be that this is not Nogeya today, because even if kibush yachid shemei kibush, it's the kedusha rishayna, meaning it was not settled b'mei Ezra, and anything that was not settled b'mei Ezra may not be chayiv anyway. So it may not be Nogeya today, but it was certainly Nogeya during the Bayis Rishain, during the reign of David HaMelech himself. So going back to the pasuk, David smote Hadadezer ben Rechav, the king of Tzaiva, that's Aram Tzaiva, that's part of Syria. Belechtoi l'hashiv yadi b'nahar Pras. When Hadadezer went all the way to the Euphrates to try to conquer more territory, that is when David Badafka attacked him, because at that point he was diverting his military resources elsewhere, and that made him more vulnerable. Vayilkait David mimenu elef ushva meyais prashim. David was able to capture 1,700 cavalry, that means people who rode horses, v'yesrim elef ish ragli, and 20,000 foot soldiers. Vayakir David is called Rechev, and David remember, there's an Isser, the Torah forbids a king to have too many horses. And since these horses were more than a king is allowed to have, so David, as it were, disabled them by hobbling them, by cutting off their hooves. Again, we saw this before, and there was a kasha of Tsar Balei Chaim, but David did this in order not to be over on the Isser, Lo Yarbe Alai Susim, Vayaser Mimenu Meya Rechev, and of the 1,700 chariots that he was able to get, he only kept for himself 100, because that was legitimately what the Melech's army needed. Now, again, what's interesting is that there is no indication that Hadadezer had attacked the Jewish people. So this seems to be a war of aggression, a war of conquest, albeit a kibush yachid. In the language of Chazal, an aggressive war of conquest is considered to be a melchemes rishus. It is not considered to be a melchemes mitzvah. But a melchemes rishus, please remember, requires not only the consent of the Melech, which you obviously had here, it was David's war, but it also requires the consent of the Sanhedrin, and most importantly, it requires the Urim v'Tumim, which essentially means direct prophetic authorization from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's very, very significant. That is why Bisman Hazeh, when we don't have an Urim v'Tumim and we don't have Nevuah, there is no halachic possibility of a legitimate war of aggression that could be called a Melchemes Rishus. There is no Melchemes Rishus today. There is only the Melchemes Mitzvah, and even Melchemes Mitzvah, we don't have Amalek, we don't have the 7 nations, but we still have a Milchama, Lahoshia Yisrael, to save the Jewish people from an enemy that attacks us. Okay. And then David made further incursions into Syria, which is also considered to be a kibush yachid. Vatavai Aram Damesek, right? There's Aram Tzaiva and Aram Damesek around Damascus. Lazor Lahadezer Melech Tzaiva, that the Syrian kingdom of Damesek came to assist Hadadezer, the king of Tzaiva, and David was victorious there too. Vayach David bi'aram esrim ushnayim elefish, and David was able to smite in Syria 22,000 casualties. Vayosem David nitzivim bi'aram Damesek, and David placed governors or overseers in the territory of Aram Damesek. Vati Aram l'David li'avadim nosei mincha, and the inhabitants of Aram became slaves of David, who would give him tribute. Vayisha Hashem es David b'chol asher halach. Wherever David turned, Hashem gave him Yeshua, salvation. Vayikach David es sholte hazav asher hayu elav dehadadezer v'yivim Yerushalayim, and David took the golden shields that the soldiers of Hadadezer had, the king of Aram Saiva, and he brought them to Yerushalayim. We're going to see that his kavanah was, he was collecting this gold for the Beis HaMikdash, not for his own tribute. Even though he couldn't build the Beis HaMikdash, he was hoping to prepare all of the materials. Umi Betach, Umi Beirosai, Ore Hadadezer. And from Betach and Beirosai, that were major cities of Hadadezer and Aram Tzeva, Lokach Hamelech David Necheshes Harbe Miyaid, he accumulated huge amounts of silver. Now, Vayishma Tayi Melech Hamas. So now we have another king, a non-Jewish king. His name is Tayi, and he is the king of Hamas. Again, Hamas is an area adjacent to Syria. It's a city. Ki hika David es kol chel Hadadezer. He had heard that David had defeated all of the mighty armies of Hadadezer, the combination of Aram Tzeva and Aram Damasek. Vayishlach Tayi es Yairam b'nai el HaMelech David. So Tayi sent Yairam, his own son, to David to make a peace treaty. Lishalo l'shalom, ulevarcha, and to bless him. Alasher nilcham b'Hadadezer. Tayi was actually very grateful that Hadadezer got defeated, because Hadadezer himself was oppressing Tayi's little kingdom of Hamas. He wanted to bless David, Alasher nilcham b'Hadadezer v'yakeyu, that he had fought against Hadadezer and he had smitten Hadadezer, meaning killed him. Ki ish milchamais Tayi haya Hadadezer. Hadadezer was an ish milchama, was a man who was waging war against Tayi. Uvi yadai hayu kli kasev u'kli zav u'kli nechaishes. And Yairam, the son of Tayi, who is coming to David to make shalom, brought silver and gold and copper. He brought a tribute to David. And Gam Aisam Hikdish HaMelech David Lashem. David was makdishit, to be used in the construction of the Mikdash. Imakeseh b'zahav asher hikdish mikol agoyim asher kavash. All of the nations that David had conquered, he had consecrated the tribute, the shalom, the spoils, to Hashem, to build the Beis HaMikdash. Aram, from Syria, Moab, and Ammon, although that was not recorded, but apparently there was a similar war against Ammon, because they were partners with Moab in murdering David's family. Plishtim, Amalek. Now Amalek is going to be a perennial problem, because obviously we know that Amalek was not totally destroyed, in spite of the fact that the Pasuk seems to say that Shaul killed everybody except the Melech. We find plenty of Amalekim who are still around. So the emes is, Amalek was not totally finished at this time, and indeed the Mefarshim tell us Amalek will not be destroyed until before Mashiach comes. But so that's why David is still waging war against Amalek. But the big problem here is that the Torah does say that Amalek, not only is Amalek destroyed, but also the Sholol of Amalek is destroyed as well, just as Shaul was commanded to destroy the animals. So the question is, how could David take the Sholol of Amalek and use it for the building of the Beis HaMikdash? The Sholol of Amalek has to be destroyed. But I think the teretz is that the only Sholol of Amalek that has to be destroyed are the animals. The animals of Amalek have to be destroyed, because Rashi brings that the Amalekim through Kishuf used to turn themselves into animals. But the gold and the silver of Amalek does not have to be destroyed. And if that's the case, we're allowed to take it, and therefore David is allowed to be makdishit to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then it goes on, Mishlal Hadadezer ben Rechav Melech Tzeva, Vayas David Shem, and David was getting a kind of a worldwide, or at least a regional reputation, Bishuvu mi'akosos Aram b'gei Melech, that in one of his fightings against Syria, in the Valley of Salt, that presumably is around the Yam HaMelech, Shmeina Hasar Elef, he killed 18,000 of them. Vayasem bi'edaim nitzivim. And even in the land of Edaim, which is south of Eretz Yisrael, south of Eilat, David was ruling over Edaim. B'chol Edaim sam nitzivim. Vayi kol Edaim avodim leDavid. Vayisha Hashem es David b'chol asher halach. Vayimleich David al kol Yisrael, and David is now king over all of Yisrael. Again, remember, for 7 years in Hebron, he was only the king over Yehuda, but now all of Am Yisrael are makabel David as a melech. Vayhi David oisem mishpat utzedakah l'chol amai, and David did justice and charity to all of his nation. The Gemara in Sanhedrin has a tremendous, interesting drasha on what is mishpat utzedakah. So the Gemara says like this: if you have two litigants, David was also a dayan, a paisek. If you have two litigants, and one person says, Ruvain says, Shimon owes me money, and the dayan paskin, Shimon owes the money. So listen to this: when Ruvain gets the money that he's entitled to get, das heißt mishpat, that is justice. But listen to this: when Shimon pays the money that otherwise would have been wrongful, that's tzedakah. It's a tzedakah to Shimon. That, people get angry if they're told by a Beis Din or a Rav they have to pay money. They feel so upset. I'm paying money. Fakert. It's a great tzedakah. We're doing you a taiva that you're not holding money shaloi kedin. Holding money shaloi kedin is a tremendous aveira. The Dor Hamabel was nanash because of the chait of Gezel. And Gezel is makatreg. It's a tremendous kitreg in Shemayim. And when you can be liberated from a gezela that you're holding, that's a tzedakah. It's a mishpat to the guy who gets his money, and it's a tzedakah v'chesed to the guy that's paying his money. And then the perek ends with kind of David HaMelech's cabinet. Vayayev ben Tzeruya al Hatzava. Yayev ben Tzeruya, that was David's general, was in charge of the army. Yehoshaphat ben Achilud Maskir. Yehoshaphat ben Achilud was David's secretary. He kept a record of all of the business that David had to do a given day, like a secretary. Today, in modern Hebrew, Maskir. Sadak ben Achituv. V'Achimelech ben Evyasar. Kohanim. Again, they were more Kohanim than them, but they were the head Kohanim. One was a Kohen Gadol, one was a Sagan. Usaraya, otherwise not known, was the cipher. He was the scribe, meaning when proclamations had to be made, he would write them up in fancy calligraphy that would then be sent out to the nation. Binayahu ben Yehoyada. This was a great, great chacham. Binayahu ben Yehoyada. Vahakresi, vahaplesi. So literally, the Targum says, Kresi are the archers. They shot the bow and arrow. And plesi are the slingshot or the catapults. And he was in charge of you might call it the artillery, the Kresi and the plesi. But again, Chazal also darshan that Kresi uplesi refers to the Urim B'tumim. Kresi, Korson. They cut off their words, meaning they're very definite. They're not marich. Plesi means they were mufla. They were wondrous answers. Now, what does it mean, according to that interpretation, that Binyo ben Yehoyada was in charge of the Urim B'tumim? Obviously, he was not in charge of the Urim B'tumim. The Urim B'tumim were the Kohen Gadol. But I think what it could mean is he was in charge of formulating the questions, because there was a great, great chachma in bidiyuk, how to ask the question in order to get the right answer. Binayahu ben Yehoyada was the one that would formulate the question that should be asked the Urim B'tumim. And then finally the perek ends, Bnei David Kaihanim Hayu. The sons of David were Kaihanim. Obviously, that's impossible. The sons of David were not Kaihanim. But Targum Yonason says the word Kaihanim here just means they were chashuv. They were very esteemed members of the court. The king would consult his sons for Eitzah. Right? That his sons were considered to be Balei Eitzah. Not only Shlomo, who of course would be a Chacham, or Shlomo may not have been born yet, but all of the sons of David were Kaihanim Hayim. Ad kan Perek Ches.